Alrighty, so following on obviously in chapter 4 today of Galatians, today we're covering verses 12 to 20. Okay, verses 12 to 20. Here in this passage, the Apostle Paul kind of doesn't transition, but makes a point, more personal point or more kind of pastoral point to them about really what he said in verse 11 where we finished last week. I fear for you that perhaps I have laboured over you, or in other words, I've done all this work among you for nothing, right, in vain. And so he diverts or makes a tangential point, kind of expressing some of his thoughts about that, obviously related to the broader topic of what the whole letter is about, of course. But much of the theme of what we'll be looking at today is largely pastoral and personal on his part. The latter portion of the chapter is another one of these major kind of deeper theological aspects. We'll be spending at least probably 2 weeks in the ending, so verses 21 to 31, maybe even 3. It depends on how long I take to go through it. But nevertheless, we'll before we get onto that, obviously we're going through this section. So there's no real cross references that we'll be looking at today per se. Probably should not be as long of a lesson. But there are some important points to take away that are relevant to this tangent that he makes here in verses 12 to 20. Right. So let's read the passage and go from there. Galatians chapter 4, verses 12 to 20. I beg of you, brothers, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You have done me no wrong. But you know that it was because of a bodily illness that I proclaimed the gospel to you the first time, and that which was a trial to you in my bodily condition you did not despise or loathe, but you received me as an angel of God, as Jesus Christ himself. Where then it is that sense of blessing that you had? For I testify to you that, if possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. So have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? They zealously seek you, not commendably, but they wish to shut you out so that you will zealously seek them. But it is good always to be zealously sought in a commendable manner, and not only when I am present with you. My children, with whom I am again in labour until Christ is formed in you. But I wish I could be present with you now and to change my tone, because I am perplexed about you. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, you might notice how different some of the subject matter is from what we've been looking at. Obviously, we've been looking at fairly deeply theological content, especially in chapter 3. Much so even in the beginning, kind of 11 verses of this chapter thus far. We've been talking a lot in previous lessons about the stoicheia and elementary principles of the universe and philosophical concepts and all these kinds of things that he's touching on, elements of the law and inheritance and all these kinds of subjects. As I said in the introduction, this is a brief tangent he makes as a point kind of off the back of verse 11, right? I fear I've done all this work for nothing, right, is essentially what he's saying. I fear I've laboured over you for nothing, right? Obviously you can tell, and this is not the first time we've kind of seen this sentiment or this expression in this letter thus far. We saw most of this actually in chapter 1, where we talked a bit more about some of the particularities in the sentiment of how he's writing this letter. We explained it all the way back, I don't expect you to remember, but to remind you, the notable lack of kind of warm, friendly greeting that is typical of the apostles' letters, be they Peter's or John's or even Paul's, right? Etc. Normally, of course, there is a paragraph or so, like any normal letter. Again, these letters are written in a very, very consistent manner with the custom of ancient Hellenistic culture, ancient Greco-Roman culture, more broadly. They follow very similar structures, which of course is what we should expect to find given their historical context, right? But in the beginning of this letter, there's no warm welcome, there's no salutations given, and that's by design because he's not writing a friendly letter in that sense, right? He's writing a letter where he is legitimately and rightfully angry over things that are going on, right, as he should be. And much of that sentiment is now coming back in this, say, tangential point. Obviously, it's an important part of the chapter, but he's making a point before then getting back to the theological content, right? So that's why I'm referring to it as a tangent or as a tangential point, right? Beginning of verse 12 kind of really begins to illuminate why I say all this, right? I beg of you, brothers, right? And again, there's nothing really complex about that word. The concept of that word in the Greek is exactly what we have in the English sense of the word beg, right? He is begging them. It's a deep sense of pleading that comes through, that is born of, at least to an element, desperation. It's the sense of imploring someone, like you're just desperately wanting them to get whatever the point is that you're trying to make, right? And he refers to them here as brothers, right? This is actually the first time, if I'm not mistaken, that he's referred to them as such, okay? Part of that customary introduction that usually occurs in these kinds of letters, again, is this expression of brotherhood. Or, often he refers to, to the saints in Corinth, right? For example, blah, 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 to the fellowship of faith, all these kinds of various terms which are used as just general terms of endearment, right? Are absent in the first chapter, in the intro where you would normally expect to find them, right? This is essentially, at least broadly speaking, the first time that they get this more familial reference, right? In the literal sense, familiar, right? Family of brothers, right? He hasn't referred to them in any endearing terms thus far. Not because he doesn't feel that, but because of the sternness of the letter, right? And the sentiment behind it, right? But because he's almost pausing, I say that quote unquote, to make a tangential point here based off of what he's already just said in verse 11, this is where it gets more personal, right? And so he implores them, he's begging them, I beg you, brothers, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You have done me no wrong. Now, naturally the question is, what on earth is he talking about? Much of the concept of this letter, of course, is about the aspects of the law and dealing with these Judaizing heretics, okay, who are Jewish Christians in the Church of Galatia, right, as we've discussed many times, who are demanding and manipulating and enticing the Celtic Christians and the Greek Christians to come back under the ceremonial aspects of the law, right? So that's why we've seen things like circumcision, the whole discourse in chapter 2 with this event with Peter of eating at separate tables and eating kosher foods, and all that being necessary for salvation, blah, blah, blah. When he says, become as I am, he's talking in reference to liberty from the law. Now, it's important to explain, obviously, what we mean by that. We already have explained this before, but it's important to reiterate. When we use a term or use a phrase like liberty from the law, okay, it should never be understood in any context whatsoever that means liberty from moral precepts or morality, right? When we speak of, or when I say when we, either me sitting here thousands of years later or the Apostle Paul thousands of years before when he writes this, when liberty is spoken of in any kind of context, because in other letters he speaks of liberty in that literal sense, he's not talking about liberty from like the Ten Commandments, okay? He's talking about liberty from the very context which this kind of letter is addressing, the ceremonial aspect of the Mosaic Code in the Old Testament, okay? All the ritual elements, all the, again, we kind of colloquially refer them as customary elements, right? Basically a part of the ceremonial law. So attire, food laws, all these kinds of aspects, right? Interactions with non-Israelites, various different things up and down the board, right? A very complex system. All there for a very specific purpose in the Old Covenant, right? To demonstrate the necessity of separation of good and evil, right? Light and darkness, order, chaos, kind of things which we talk about all the time. And these really overt external systems were to give just that, an external, overt, systematic demonstration of those principles, right? Of course, much of the New Covenant is about, as we see in the Gospels, Pharisees and Sadducees, at least to a degree, maintaining external elements with no internal reality, right? No genuine allegiance to God in their hearts, right? In fact, this point gets explicitly made at a certain point in the Gospels, especially in John, where Christ condemns the Pharisees for the unforgivable sin of blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, an oft misunderstood concept. In simple terms, that sin is at least functionally impossible to commit now, but nevertheless, it is the sin of witnessing with your own eyes the working and miracles of God, knowing that they are such for a fact, and then choosing to attribute them to devils or demonic powers, right? Just as the Pharisees did. It's why Nicodemus, in his famous, who was a Pharisee, right, who then becomes a Christian, we don't explicitly get told that, but the fact that he buries Jesus is kind of the subtle tip of the cap to that fact. He says, we know, as in we, the Pharisees, right? He meets secretly with Jesus in the night, of course. We know that you are a teacher sent from God, and that you do these things, as in all these miraculous things, by God, right? So the Pharisees knew that. They knew he was from God. They knew he was the Christ and the Messiah. They chose to reject him, right? It's not because they didn't understand. No, they understood full well. They just didn't like it. And they didn't want him to be the Messiah, and they didn't want him to be the foretold king. Why is this important? Because it speaks to this aspect of what I'm talking about in regards to liberty from the law. Okay, when he says become as I am, he is talking about the freedom that exists in Christ from the bonds of the Mosaic code in the Old Testament. Okay, not law, the law of God, what we call the divine law in short terms, not morality, right, which is codified in the Ten Commandments and itself then codified in the two basic commands that really are the two tables of the law, right? Love the Lord your God and love your neighbour as yourself, okay? Christ himself reiterates that, of course. It comes from the Old Testament. Christ repeats it in the Gospels. He's talking specifically about all the other aspects which come from that in regards to the ceremonial law, okay? Which distinguished an Israelite from everyone else who is not an Israelite, okay? Again, had a good purpose and a necessary purpose in the Old Covenant, but it's fulfilled and completed in the New Covenant. Christ himself perfectly upholds it. He accomplishes it. It served its purpose, and we've spoken a number of times, be it here or Sunday sermons even, also we're going through the book of Deuteronomy, so quite relevant, about the fact that things in the Old Covenant foreshadow the new. You don't keep doing the things that foreshadow the thing that's now already come. Christ and the New Covenant, okay? They've served their purpose. It's why they weren't there from the time of Adam and Eve, right? No one from Adam all the way down to Abraham and Isaac was ever circumcised, for example, okay? None of them spoke Hebrew. None of them abstained from pork. I'm just picking random things here, right? None of them made sure that they didn't wear cloths of two different fabrics, all these kinds of various elements, right? It had a specific purpose for a set time from the days of, really technically speaking, Moses, down through to that of the time of the inauguration of the New Covenant, right? What's called the New and Greater Covenant, or the Better Covenant, right? So become as I am, right? In other words, free, not from God, not free from morality, not free from what's good. We never want to be free of that, right? But free from these old covenant ceremonial customs that have now been fulfilled. However, right, despite the fact that in this context in Galatia, in the churches of southern Galatia, there is an inordinate amount of Jewish Christians who are attempting to try and keep them under that as necessary for salvation, right? Hence why he says, become as I am, for I have become as you are, right? What he means by this is the inference, contextually speaking, I, ethnically Jewish, speaking as Paul, have become as you, Celts and Greeks, right? Gentiles, who have never known any of these customs before, none of you have undergone the ritual of circumcision, none of you have had any of these Mosaic customs, right? I've become like you, become like me, right? Because this is the great irony. Paul is living more like a Gentile Christian than the Gentile Christians in Galatia. That's the issue. Do you know what I'm saying to you, right? It's completely topsy-turvy. And he finishes that verse by saying, "You have done me no wrong." Right? He's leveling with them here. Okay. Verse 13. But you know that it was because of a bodily illness. The literal phrase is like a weakness of the flesh, but it's talking about like hence why we say bodily illness, right? It was because of bodily illness that I proclaimed the gospel to you the first time, right? In other words, what we have in the book of Acts, kind of chapters 12, 13, 14, roughly speaking, where he's on his first missionary journey through in Galatia, right? Where he comes to places like, especially the four main cities of southern Galatia, where these churches are. Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. Okay, you can read about that in those chapters, as I said, kind of Acts chapters 12, 13, 14, roughly. And he explains here that he had a bodily illness, which is what actually made him come to Galatia. Now, I don't recall a specific reference to that in Acts, which is not a problem, because again, the things that get covered in one place don't get covered in another place because they've already got covered somewhere else. But here, again, and I could just be completely misremembering, but here he explains that it's actually because of a physical illness that made him take the journey down into southern Galatia, where there are a number of major cities, right? Especially larger cities like Derbe and Lystra, for example.
So he changed his plans,
Whether changed your plans or whether basically, at some point as he was moving through, he's coming eastward. If we had I don't know if we have any of the maps here. Maybe we do. Yes, we do. Let me go and grab one of them. Or see if you have your map in any of your notes. Maybe. There we go. Bingo. Yep. You need one. There's a copy over there as well. Yep. You can grab one. That's fine. So, yeah. So I'm just going to try and find it on my stuff. Okay, here we go. So, so if you look at that map, I'm just going to make sure. Can you show me your map just to make sure I have the same one? Yeah, good. That's close enough. Yep, sweet. That's cool. So yeah, you can see in your maps should be obviously on the. Yes, okay. So Janine and I have the same one. You two have the other one that I printed, but again, I can just commentate from there. You see the province of Asia. So again, we're used to thinking of Asia as being all the way over where we call Asia these days. Asia is the Greek name for the east, hence why this part of Asia, it's where the name for the continent comes from. It's basically everything east of Greece. So on Janine's map, it's the yellow colour. On your maps, it's the kind of reddish colour. But you see also then Galatia in the middle, which should be green on both maps. Okay, and if you come down to the southern portions, right? So the green region of Galatia from the north comes to a thinner portion. That's the plains of Laconia, which separate kind of northern Galatia and southern Galatia, and you should see a number of cities there in that southern green portion in central Anatolia, what today is Turkey, right? So Antioch in Pisidia, or Pisidian Antioch as it's known as well. You'll see also Iconium, so Iconium, Iconium. Lystra is just south of that, right? Lystra, Lystra. And then if you just go straight east from Lystra, you'll get to Derbe, Derbe, right? These are the four major cities in Roman times of southern Galatia, right? And so this is where the churches are, right? Galatia is not just one place. So the letter to the Galatians is the churches that have been established across this diocese or this province, right? This region, okay? It's the main route you would take. Even if you go just east of Derbe, you'll see a city in What on your maps will be purple, what on Janine's map will be orange. Cilicia, Cilicia. So Cilicia. And it should have the city of Tarsus there along the coast, Tarsus, Tarsus. That's Paul's hometown. Yeah, that's where he's from, yeah. Which is a Greek city. He went to the University of Tarsus. So he received much of his Greek education from there, etc. And so, hence the distinction. But to get, from those places like Colossae, which is west of Pisidia, if you'll see again in the yellow/red sections, right across the Phrygian mountains, Colossae, Colossae, Colossae. Obviously, that's where the letter to the Colossians is written. There's a number of churches there. Laodicea is there from Revelation. It's in a place called the Valley of the Lycus. There's a river that runs through there. The Church of Hierapolis, which is not mentioned in the Bible, but is one of the early churches. These are the places where if you were traveling from Asia, any of the major cities, right, across to Tarsus, you would traverse through southern Galatia, because there's major cities there at that time, especially Antioch and Pisidia. So in other words, Pisidian Antioch, and Derbe and whatnot, right? So that's what causes the diversion, is what he's essentially indicating here, right? This health issue. Now, he does hint at what that is in verse 15, okay? But let's just read through verse 14 to keep going. There we go. So verse 14, and that which was a trial to you in my bodily condition. In other words, that which, my bodily illness, which caused you in inconvenience, right? Because you were having to take care of me. That's the essence of the trial in that sense, right? That which was a trial to you in my bodily condition, you did not despise or loathe, right? So he's commending him. Again, this sounds like a complex way of saying it, but in essence what he's saying is, I was physically ill, like I was physically unwell. It was a burden to you to have to take care of me, but you did it without complaint, without loathing, right? He's commending them. He's reminding them of their past together, right? He's reminding them of the brotherhood that they have together, hence verse 12, right? I beg you, brothers. The inconvenience that taking care of me whilst I was among you and teaching you and all these things, right? You didn't despise me for it. You didn't look down upon me for it. You didn't moan. You didn't complain, right? That's the whole loathing element. You helped me, right? But rather, hence why he says at the end of verse 14, but rather you received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus himself, right? Now, there's a bit of a kind of play on words in one sense, because the Greek term angelos, which is where we get the word angel from, means a messenger, okay? There are other times in the scriptures where the word messenger is used in relation to people. It doesn't actually mean an angelic being. It's using the general sense of the word angel to mean a messenger, because that's what that term literally means. The book of Revelation at one point actually uses that in some of the earlier chapters, where the angels of the churches are discussed, where it's talking in one sense about that, but also talking about the ministers of those churches, right? But that's another subject. But long story short, what he's saying is, again, he's using an analogy, right? He's not being literal. You received me as if I was Jesus Christ himself, right? You took real good care of me, right? Even though taking care of me was a burden upon you, right? He's commending them, and again, hence why he's kind of tying into the end of verse 12, you've done me no wrong, right? He's reminding them of what they have together for the reason that then will eventually come up, okay? Verse 15, where then is that sense of blessing that you had? Right? For I testify that, if possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. What he's doing here is indicating what the source of his illness was. He had an eye condition. He had an issue with his eyes, ironically. He had an issue with his eyes. Partly, and again, this is purely speculative. We never directly told this, so it doesn't go beyond speculation. But it would be in keeping with his past, given the fact that in that unique encounter on the road to Damascus, which of course brings about his conversion, he is blinded, if you recall. Okay? And he's blinded, and then one of the deacons of the church of Damascus is used by God to restore his sight at his baptism, right? When he's baptized, his sight comes back, right? All of this is to, again, it's symbolic, for deep symbolic purposes of demonstrating Paul's blindness, right? Because the most talented and well-educated Pharisee in all of Israel could not see that Jesus was the Messiah, right? And so the irony of the blindness is part of the point, right? So that's kind of how God does things, right? He uses these material, vivid, ecstatic examples to prove points. And nevertheless, it also ties into Paul's own sufferings throughout his life, because there's almost no one who suffered more than Paul in the first century, among the apostles or just about anyone else, quite frankly. When Paul spoke to the deacon of Damascus, he said that among the things that Jesus told him to say, he said, you must show him all that he must suffer for my name. Right? That's what the message finished with. So Paul had this ongoing physical ailment with his own eyes. Right? That's why he says, I know that if possible you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. Okay? So that was his condition. He had an eye condition of some kind. What that means, who knows, right? It's not like we shouldn't expect to find the word cataracts in there, right? But he had an eye condition of some kind, right? Point being that he is reminding the Galatians here of their history, of their past together, of the care and commitment that they've had to each other, of the friendship, the brotherhood, more than just friendship, the brotherhood that they've had with each other, right? But that's why he asks this rhetorical question at the beginning of verse 16. The beginning of verse 15, right? As well. Sorry, he does also in verse 16, but just the first one in verse 15. Where then is that sense of blessing you had? Right? Why have you turned against me now? After all that we've been through, and over the course of years, after everything I've done for you, right? He's not being pompous. He's being just historically accurate, right? After all that I've done for you, and you for me, right? I in teaching and guiding you and leading you, you in helping me physically because of my own ailment with my eyes, right? Where's that sense of blessing that you had originally? Because you've gone cold on me here, right? You're turning away from me, and he doubles down on that by asking another rhetorical question again in the beginning of verse 16. So have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? A very powerful question. You could probably do a sermon just on that one sentence, quite frankly. Have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? He's harkening back, obviously, to, well, more than just this, but he's harkening back to the events described in chapter 2, right? Where you've got the Jewish Christians, the Judaizers, and many of the Galatian and Greek Christians who have been brought under their sway, siding against the minority who have not joined them. And that includes, unfortunately, Peter, the apostle, being brought under their manipulation. And having this encounter or this interaction over communion, right? Where Paul publicly calls out Peter. We saw that in chapter 2. Right? Many of the Galatian Christians were turning away from Paul and siding with the Judaizers. Right? Have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? It's a very, you may already gather a sense of it, but it's a very, very profound thing to say, quite frankly. Because it touches on so many things. The essence of truth is really part of that question. The essence of allegiance to the truth is also the other fundamental aspect, right? So if I just touch on those two concepts for a while. We, of course, speak so often here, as any church should, quite frankly, about the nature of truth. about the things like epistemologies. In other words, how do we know what is true? Right. So what is knowledge, and how do we come to know what is true within our own mortal capacity? Things like the ontology of truth, so the nature of truth. What is truth? The very kind of question that Pontius Pilate asked Christ at his trial: "Quid est veritas?" What is truth? A fundamental question that a Roman would, of course, be interested in by virtue of their deep philosophical culture. It speaks to the objectivity of truth, and by virtue of that, this concept of enmity, which is then tied into this kind of question: have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? Right? The third and final component, again, I'll get onto actually we'll touch on the second, of enmity. The objective reality of truth, the reality that truth is objective, in other words, it's not subjective. That is to say, it is not determined by the arbitration of subjective elements or principles or powers like human beings or anything else like that. That there is an objective reality to truth is something which, again, we do know. Okay, obviously, various different cultures and various different peoples throughout time, various different ideologies have had differing opinions as to the objectivity or subjectivity of truth. However, the reality, pardon the pun, that has stood the test of time is that of the objectivity of truth. Right? We see this, for example, in mathematics, that 1 + 1 = 2, regardless of whether or not anyone actually agrees with that statement. Okay, we obviously use things like words to communicate these abstract realities, right? Because mathematics is abstract. Indulge me in the philosophy of mathematics for just a moment to make this point. We use other physical representations like scribbles on pieces of paper, and depending on what language you're using, the characters will look different, but long story short, we use other such physical manifestations like our fingers and our toes, our digits, right? That this many combined with this many is the exact same as this many. Whatever we want to call those things in this language or that language or whatever it happens to be. The reality is that when you combine this many with this many, it will always be the equivalent, i.e. the equal of this many. It will never be this many, it will never be this many, it will never be this many. It will always be this many. This, right? Every single human being, theoretically speaking, could drop dead right now, and the reality that 1 + 1 = 2 would still exist. Okay? And we know that because when any one of us dies individually, 1 + 1 = 2, that still exists, right? Because it exists in a mind. It actually, ironically, is something that testifies to the reality of God. Because if mathematics exists outside of the human mind, but it's abstract, it must exist in someone's mind. And if it's not humanities, it must be something else, namely God. All of this is to speak to the fact that when you are out of, you hear me use the term out of alignment. It sounds very new agey. I'm using it in the sense that actually has legitimacy and makes sense, not in the kind of modern neo-pagan sense of aligning your chakras or something. I mean, by being in alignment, I mean in your heart, in your mind, and in your actions. Okay, being in conformity with the truth, right, is also how you could say this. Being in conformity with truth is important to all manner of things apart from just the basic essence of what is good and true. It is how we as human beings flourish. It is how human civilization flourishes. It is why Christian civilization has been able to be built up for 2,000 years and counting, and has been able to produce the heights of human civilization, because the more you are in conformity with divine truth, with the truth of God, the better things will be. That is the very essence of order. Okay? This is exactly what you had in the garden prior to the fall. You had perfect harmony, perfect conformity to the truth. Until, of course, we decided not to do that anymore. Until we decided to do something else other than be in conformity with the truth. Right? Being obviously out of conformity, being out of alignment with that, is described very consistently as a state of enmity, in other words, being an enemy. Okay, it is why, for example, Christ says, "You are either with me or you are against me." Right? There is no middle ground. There is no sense of not being in allegiance to Jesus Christ, but still considering yourself to be on friendly terms with him in some regard, or having a favourable view towards Christianity, for example. Right? We're seeing that a little bit even now. Right? After the kind of fad pop culture level of atheism of the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, all of a sudden, many people, including the very same kinds of public figures in the West who promulgated those ideas, are now realizing that everything has turned into a dumpster fire, and that we can't even figure out what a woman is, and we can't even determine various basic essences of what a country actually is, and we don't know up from down or left from right or inside from out anymore. And all of a sudden now, Christian culture and Christian customs are being commended as good and virtuous, and this is what built up civilization, which is all 100% true. The West has entirely been built by Christianity from the ground up, infinitely more than anything from Greece and Rome, but it's too late for that. There's no such thing as being friendly with Jesus without being in allegiance to him, right? You can do it, but it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. It's utterly irrelevant. Right? You are with him or you are against him. There is no middle ground. There's no fence sitting, right? The devil owns the fence, and you are with him or you're against him as far as he's concerned. Right? And the reason why he's concerned that way is because he's the one who determines those things. You are either with the truth or you're against the truth. There is no middle ground, right? In chapter 3, kind of in the first 10 or 11 verses, somewhere around there, we talked a lot about truth, right, as a concept, because that was much of what the verses were focused on, right? And we did a fairly deep dive, at least for this level of study, into the philosophy of truth specifically, right? So I'm not going into heaps of depth here. One of the operative phrases that I explained there is that if something is 99% true, it's 100% false, okay? We explained the differences between lies of omission and lies of fabrication, all these kinds of things. You can go back and revisit that lesson if you'd like to. But the point, to summarize, that was explained there is that truth is total, right? There is no sense of partiality. Okay, when I say there's no sense, you can literally do it. You can tell what we call a half-truth, but it's not actually the truth. That's why we also have these phrases in English like half-truth, to designate what it is, right? To delineate it from something that is actually true, okay? The notion of totus veritas, the total truth, is the essence of what is kind of capital T truth, right? And so it is in many senses a zero-sum game. It's either entirely true or it's entirely false, no matter how much of a percentile it happens to be true. Right? Hence why we fall short as human beings in that regard. There is a purity to the very essence of what is truth. Okay. More on that in those lessons that we looked at in the prior chapter. Right. In our context here, this is the reason why the word enmity is being used. Right. There's also obviously a personal element to this as well, right? Because keeping in mind there are subjects here, right? Have I become your enemy by telling you the truth, right? So he's not just speaking in like purely abstract philosophical senses. There's a direct, very tangible, very earthy application here. Have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? Right? Rhetorical question. Okay? Because that's how they're treating him. They're treating him as an enemy because he is correcting them. Right? Like we saw in chapter 2, for example, when he's recounting the prior events that have led up to him writing this letter. Okay? They are siding with the heretics. They are siding with the Judaizers, increasingly in droves, right? In those churches, as this heresy has got a vice grip upon these places, and they are treating Paul as an enemy. They are now considering him an enemy. Why? Because that's exactly what the Judaizers are telling them, right? They are manipulating them, they're propagandizing them, they're indoctrinating them. They are poisoning the well, which is a philosophical concept, right? To poison the well is where you, again, it's kind of incumbent in the name. Instead of actually making, if you're in a discussion with someone, and let's just say it was in front of other people, or it doesn't have to be a discussion. You're talking with someone about some other person. You've never met the third party. You've never met the other person before. But this other person that you're talking to tells you that this other person is deceptive, or they're sneaky, or they're a liar, right? Maybe they are, or maybe the person telling you that's lying. Maybe the person that's telling you that is bitter. Maybe the person that's telling you that is trying to manipulate you against that person for some particular purpose or reason that human beings do, right? You've never met that person in your life. You don't know who they are necessarily. Or they may be new to the church or something like this, or some organisation, wherever you happen to be part of, right? But now, as soon as you meet that person for the first time, you're not really actually meeting them for the first time. You're meeting them with the bias that's already been told to you, the preconception that's been given to you about who they are. And so now every interaction that you will ever have with them is come from these words from someone else that, oh, watch out for this person, they're sneaky and they're deceptive. Again, that could be true, they could be warning you, or they could be manipulating you, right? It's called poisoning the well, right? That's what's being done to Paul, right? Oh, Paul's abandoning us, as in like the Jewish Christians. Paul's abandoning his ancestors, he's abandoning the Jews, right? He's becoming like the Gentiles, the Greeks, our oppressors, the people who conquered us under Alexander. He's becoming like the Romans who have been oppressing us since, for 100 years now, which is more about, roughly speaking, what it is by this point. He's siding with our oppressors, right? He's abandoning the customs of Moses, right? Like, what would Moses be doing? Like if you brought Moses back from the dead right now, he'd be ashamed of Paul. Blah, 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 blah. Right? That's what they're doing. Have I become an enemy to you because I tell you the truth? And this is something that has been a feature of Christian history time and time again, even famous figures like St. Athanasius, for example, in the 4th century. Right? The height of the Arian heresy, right? We cover this in our church history course in the early church, for example. Athanasius is famous for famous for many sayings, but his most famous saying is one that was attributed to him and then later on inscribed upon his tomb: Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world, by virtue of one of his most famous declarations: if the world goes against the truth, or stands against the truth, in other words, if the world stands against the truth, I stand against the world. It's why he's remembered and honoured as a hero. Exiled 5 times by various emperors, persecuted in his own homeland of Alexandria in Egypt, defrocked, removed, beaten, harassed, rioted against, buildings burnt down, etc. If the world stands against the truth, I stand against the world. Right? It's a famous declaration, and so this notion is very much inspired, I suppose, by the words of verse 16. So have I become your enemy because I tell you the truth? Right? It's also in a sense a kind of condemnation upon whomever that is being said to, in this case the Galatians, right? At least in one respect. Have I become your enemy because I tell you the truth? Right? What does that implicitly mean, or what's he implicitly saying? Well, he's saying that the Galatian Christians are enemies of the truth, which they are. That's what they're doing. The Judaizers certainly are. And the Galatians, which are being brought under their manipulation and their sway, are becoming that as well. And to be an enemy of the truth is to be an enemy of God. Right? We don't take that concept seriously enough, to be totally honest with you. Right? I don't want to make a big point out of this per se, because I could just keep sitting here all afternoon talking about it. Our ancestors used to take that concept much more seriously. Right? It's why we tend to look back, even in many Christian circles, and look back at things like the Inquisition, for example, in the medieval period. Right? Again, a very misunderstood thing, as most as most historical things usually tend to be. The Inquisition lasted about 400 years. In sum total, about 3,000 people, roughly speaking, were faced trial and put to death. Usually those figures get grossly blown. About 3,000. The numbers vary depending on what source you're talking about. But that's over the course of about 400 years, right? 3,000 dead in the Soviet Union was a slow Tuesday. We tend to look back on these historical events with very tainted glasses. And the absolute vast preponderance of those were entirely justified. Vast majority. It was people teaching others witchcraft and demon worship and all kinds of things. The reality is that the reason why these kinds of things occur, and again, it was under very lengthy trials and adjudications, the vast majority of people that came and went, again, faced justice. The reality is because, just as we've seen, when heresies flourish, entire people groups can get carried away into absolute and utter chaos and nonsense. It leads to the destruction of families. It leads to the destruction of cities. It leads to the ruin of entire people groups, as I just said, right? And this is an especially difficult concept for us to understand in our modern secular age, in an age where progressively from the modernism of centuries past into the postmodernism of today, in relation to what is true, today, again, the prevailing philosophical concept which dominates our culture is that there is no objective truth, and more importantly, not only is truth entirely subjective, but really at the end of the day, what is true? Well, we don't know. We don't know. By the time you get to the late 20th century, that's more or less the fundamental point. It may not be one that you personally have held to, but that is the prevailing concept, right? It's why we have a whole new host of moral laws that govern our society implicitly without ever being declared as such. It's why we have all the things that we used to have in Christian society that have been completely turned around, right? We think we're free of many of these things, of these trappings of our Christian past as they're so viewed as. But in reality, all we've done is substitute them for their secular kind of quasi-atheistic equivalent. We have blasphemy trials now, right? The equivalent of a blasphemy trial is being brought before the HR department of some corporation for having posted something a bit unkosher on Twitter, right? And having an opinion that maybe differs from whatever the corporate governance policy is and the diversity, equity and inclusion ethics of that corporation is, or that school is, or that government department is. And to contravene those things is blasphemous. And you will be fired, and you will be blacklisted, and all those various things, right? To declare that men cannot become women, to declare that two men living together does not constitute a marriage, to declare that that nationality actually has ancestral roots and an ethnic component and other such things is flat-out heresy, right? To declare that the government is not the highest or final authority in matters of truth and morality is heresy, right? We have these various things. And you are tried and found wanting in these matters. The ways in which you are persecuted are largely social at this point, although there are criminal elements. They're not so much here, but certainly in places like the United Kingdom and in Europe, right? There are tens of thousands of people sitting in prisons right now across Europe and across the United Kingdom for praying silently in their head outside of an abortion clinic, for example. Okay, 3,000 people a year in one form or another are prosecuted in the United Kingdom for what essentially is thought crime. Okay, these are the kind of things which occur when you replace truth with lies, with new truths, with the subjective whims of ideological truth, which come and go like the wind throughout human history, right? And so when that's the case, you become an enemy to the current cultural zeitgeist of your particular time. Again, it's not the first time this has happened. We just happen to be in one of those times. And so to finalize this broader point that I'm drawing as an abstraction from this verse is that if the world goes against truth, we must stand against the world, right? If the culture around us abandons truth, which it has, again, I'm saying to you, it is difficult to get more insane than we currently are at the moment, right? It's very difficult. It can happen. There are a couple of things you could tick off the list at the moment, but we're basically almost at the bottom of the list of things, right? When you can no longer genuinely articulate in a meaningful sense, right, what defines a man and a woman. I know you said the example earlier, it's just a really obvious one, right? When you can have people in the highest ranks and levels of government who, when asked under oath in a Senate hearing committee, for example, what is a woman, and they not only can they not give you an answer, they will not give you an answer. You can't actually get much further beyond that level of absolute delusion and insanity. There's not really any, there's not much of the barrel left. You're basically essentially at the bottom, right? And so these kinds of things, this is the nature of how this goes. It's never been, and I will say this to help us, we think of it as being very difficult to be Christian in the modern age, and there is many respects in which that's true. I'm not discounting that. However, in many respects, it's actually never been easier, because to stand against the insanities of the modern world, you basically just have to not be delusional. Okay, right? You have to just essentially not be absolutely out of your mind, right? You essentially just have to say that pedophilia is like not okay, even though there's entire communities that promote it as a good thing and practice it and encourage it and all those kinds of things. You basically just have to say that men and women are actually a real thing, and we actually know exactly what they are, and you can actually define it, believe it or not. You actually have to be able to say that that importing 10 trillion people from all manner of portions around the world and expecting them to all live cohesively and coherently together, even though they have completely different worldviews and completely different religions, completely different moral standards, that idea just won't work, and that maybe, I don't know, we should just get back to how we always did it for thousands of years, where people had distinct cultures and actually things that worked, right? Like, it's not even just like a moral thing, it just doesn't work, right? All these kinds of things, you just essentially have to stick to the reality of what we in essence know, because the enmity of truth that we exist in today, the kind of state of enmity, gets down to the very heart of what it even means to be a human being anymore, right? Where every instinct that we have is attempted to be manipulated and suppressed, right? This goes for men, it goes for women in different ways, right? Again, I could regale about this for a long time, right? But I'll leave it there. He asks them fundamentally again, have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? The answer is, of course, yes and no, in a sense. He's not a real enemy for telling them the truth. But if someone considers you an enemy for you having told them the truth, it's because they are the enemy of truth. That's the reality, right? Anyone who speaks the truth is not an enemy, right? Except to those who are enemies of the truth. And that's why he says this most kind of poignant question, right? Verse 17, they zealously seek you. The they in reference here is the heretics, okay? Yeah. The Judaizers, the Jewish Christians in this congregation, right? They zealously seek you. Zealously meaning passionately, right? The concept of zeal, right? They eagerly seek you. Not commendably, right? So commend, in other words, honourably, not for good reason, not because they really care about you and they want to see you sanctified in the Lord. They want to see you grow in faithfulness and in trust and in the fruits of the Spirit, right? They don't want what's best for you, right? The Galatian churches are in the middle of a civil war, whether they realize it or not, whether they accept it or not, right? In this case, it's a theological civil war. It's an ideological civil war, right? They zealously seek you, not commendably, not morally, not honourably, but they wish to shut you out so that you will zealously seek them. You may not understand the dynamic. What he's saying. What he's saying here, the shutting out is shutting you out from me, right? They're isolating you from me by poisoning you against me. That's the whole, have I become your enemy by telling you the truth, right? They're poisoning the world against you in relation to me. They're telling you all these things about me. They're lying about me. They're slandering me, right? So they're isolating, right? To cut you off from me so that then they can prey, P-R-E-Y, upon you. Do you understand what I mean? Right, that's the dynamic what he's saying, okay? Very, very straightforward manipulative tactics. I'm not speaking endearingly of manipulation, I'm speaking just in a factual sense, right? This kind of manipulation is obviously immoral and wrong, right? But it's still very practical, it works, right? There are things that just work on human beings. There are things, quite frankly, in regards to manipulation, this is a point worth making, I wasn't planning on saying this, but I might as well, is that, especially in our day where we live in an information age, a digital age, and an age where we're getting very close to the point where unless you really, really know what you're looking for, you will have exactly zero ability to distinguish between a genuine, real video or photo and that produced by AI, right? We're basically almost there at this point. This goes to the nature of truth and manipulation, other such things. The reason why manipulators are usually so good as they are is by virtue of their own intelligence and by virtue of practice, quite frankly, okay? This is a general pastoral point which would be good to make in any condition, but this is perhaps one of the most apt texts to use for this, because he's speaking directly about this. Like, he's warning them. They're trying to isolate you, to cut you off from me, so they can manipulate you further, right? He's being very pastoral here, right? So this is a good pastoral point that's worth making anyway, and this would be true at any time in history, right? One of the best ways to avoid being manipulated, pardon me, is to understand how manipulation works, okay? There's 1,000 different tactics or strategies for manipulation. I'm using that number figuratively, of course. That P-R-E-Y, prey upon various different aspects of the human condition, right, and the human mind. Some of them good, some of them faulty, right? So exploiting weaknesses in human behavior and thinking is such ways. Sometimes taking actual human strengths, like things which in their own right are good, but you can misdirect or redirect them into the direction that you want them to go and end up actually serving your purposes, right? Many a great mind throughout history has pondered how to do this, both at the individual levels all the way up to, empires and kingdoms, right? Much more systematic levels. But in this particular case, the strategy that's being used is one that is very simple and is one that actually is quite effective. When he says cut off in this case, right, the specific phraseology, or shut out, against somewhat similar verb, but in this case shut out. They zealously seek you, not commendably, but they wish to shut you out so that you will zealously seek them, right? Trying to isolate you from me, who's your teacher, your leader, your guider, right? I'm an apostle, right? Speaking as Paul. You now no longer have leadership and that kind of guidance. So you will need to turn to someone else for that leadership. Do you see the point? And they're going to swoop in and present themselves as genuine leaders who can lead you and guide you and will show you the way and et cetera, right? We'll be talking about the JW. I was obviously going through that in our restorationist thing, yeah. In our restorationist course, yeah. It is in some respects like that, absolutely, yeah. Yes, especially in the case of the JWs, where we're watching material from outside of the Watchtower organisation is more or less expressly forbidden, yeah. And that way you cut off people, your adherents from the outside world, at least in terms of like content and media, and that the Watchtower Society becomes the sole source of truth and information, right? We will be your sole source of truth, to quote the former New Zealand Prime Minister. And New South Wales Health Department, and yeah, correct. But without being smart, though, in fairness, that's exactly what you saw. And I kind of feel like COVID's become the new World War II. Somehow, you used to always be able to bring a conversation somehow back to something in World War II. Now you can bring it back to COVID somehow. I think maybe it's still just in recent vintage, right? Yeah, the reality is that. And I'm just talking purely at the level of government and bureaucracy at this point, right? Regardless of anything else to do with actual laws or specifics about medical options or vaccines or anything. Just at the basic information level, right? Very, again, simple but very effective techniques and methods were used to guide and manipulate and direct the Australian populace, and everyone else for that matter, into the direction that was desired, okay? Using the exact same kind of techniques that are being employed here, right? For starters, you shut down the entirety of civilization, effectively. You curfewed and quarantined everyone, regardless of whether or not they were actually ill, which is largely unprecedented. Also unbiblical. We talked about that during the time, but that's a different subject. And you flooded your means of communication, be they on social media, corporate media, or government media, with the exact same unilateral message, right? The exact same linear message directed from a singular source, namely a press conference at 11 a.m. every single morning, right? The purpose of doing that, again, is to isolate, and you isolate individuals and families from either each other or from other families in the community. Community gatherings and organisations were effectively outlawed. Couldn't go to church for 6 months. Do all this kind of stuff, right? Blah, blah. All the kinds of other avenues of community, right? Sports, community groups, pick a thing you want, right? Anything that contravened or contradicted in any form or sense the specific, as I said, unilateral government messaging was very widely and very effectively branded as this magical incantatory word that we have now, which is not lies, yes, misinformation, okay? We have perfectly good words in English for things that are untrue. And it's word like lies or false, right? Falsehoods, for example. These new magical words like misinformation or disinformation, which essentially mean nothing, at least not in any technical sense, are used rapidly and in widespread form today in many respects. Forget COVID, it's used all the time now, to designate much of what I was talking about earlier. Someone or something that is saying something in contravention to the accepted dogmas of the day that cannot truly be called a lie, but can be called and branded as otherwise blasphemous or heretical to the modern ideology of the world. Yeah? Because as soon as you call something a lie, it's a very definitive claim, right? It's why, generally speaking, when people are insulted when they get called a liar, right? Because it's a very big claim, right? If someone says you're a liar, it's not, again, we don't use that, we don't throw the term lie around for someone who's ever told a lie once in their life, because that's literally every human being ever, right? That's not what we call a liar, right? When we say someone's a liar, what we really mean is this person, it's kind of what we call a habitual lie. Like, this person has a track record of consistently lying about XYZ thing or in XYZ circumstance, whatever. That's why it's such an insult, right? Even if it's true, it's usually taken with offence, right? And it's a very serious claim, because it's not just talking about someone who's ever told a single lie ever. It means this person has an abusive relationship with the truth. That's what it means, right? So calling someone or people's, again, singularly or otherwise, liars, or this person is lying, or this person is telling a lie, is a claim that can and indeed must be proven and defended, right? Because if you can't do that, if you can't actually demonstrate this person's lying, then guess what that makes you? The liar. You become, in this case, it's actually a form of slander, right? Or libel, depending on how it's done, right? Written or spoken. So it's very categorical. But it's why we have this term of misinformation or disinformation, which gets floated around, which again effectively means nothing. There's no real genuine unified agreed upon definition of what on earth misinformation even means, right? Other than this is information that is different to what we, the established authority of XYZ, what happens to be government or otherwise, is telling you. And so do not believe it, because we're not the ones who told you it. But we're no longer operating in categories of truth and error anymore. Now we're operating in categories of authority, and who has the right to determine who can say what, and who has the right to determine what even is truth anymore. What's real, or as I'm saying, this is the nature of how tyranny works. This is exactly what's being done here, right? They are manipulating, the Judaizers I'm talking about, right? They are manipulating the Galatian Christians by cutting them off from Paul, shutting out, to use his terminology, so that they are desperate for leadership and guidance, because keeping in mind, these guys have been Christian for all of 5 minutes, comparatively speaking, right? They've only been Christian a couple of years. They need leadership. It's not just that they want it, they need leadership. They need teaching, and they need guidance. But by cutting them off from their spiritual father, right? I'm not talking about God, I'm talking about in the faith, right? They are then hoping to supplant Paul as that option. Cut them off from Paul, shut them out, to use his terminology, so they'll come running to us. And we'll then teach them how to do these things, okay? They're seeking to replace Paul. And then they're the ones in power, and they're the ones in control. It's why I've been using these comparisons to the modern world, because this is exactly what we have occurring for us, just in a whole different setting on a whole different subject, right? In the modern secular world, without any vague shadow of doubt, government has replaced God, effectively. And it has various ways in which it's done this, because we must keep in mind that the relationship between the governments of the West and the corporations of the West and the education systems of the West and other institutions of the West is that of being joined at the hip, right? It is why so many people now are dependent on government for various such things. It's why over half the country is in one form or another financially dependent on the government in order to live, be it through welfare or government employment or government contracts or other such things, where if they didn't have those things, obviously they would no longer have funds, or they would no longer have, their business would go out of business, right, with no more contracts coming in, etc., right? We never used to live this way. And these are not secular issues that Christians, who cares, it doesn't really matter, or why is a clergyman talking about this? This impacts how we live, not even just individually, although of course it does. It impacts our entire communities. It impacts our Christian communities. It impacts our churches, right? Because that's, speaking of COVID, exactly what we saw. Churches descended into what amounted to no less of a civil war than this over how we were to proceed. This church went through it, right? Half the congregation left, and that half of the congregation was replaced by, well, actually everyone sitting here, quite frankly, that half of the congregation was replaced by people who also were effectively kicked out of their other churches and came over here. I love St Hilda's, love those guys. I know Murray well, right? The rector there, the minister there, right? Known him for a long time, right, a number of years. Known his predecessor, more importantly, since I was a child, good family friend. I love that place. My brother was married there, right? I sent them up there because 100 years ago they decided to put 2 aisles in, not one, here, right? Doesn't really work for weddings. But many people exchanged between that congregation and this one over this very issue, right? People left here to go there. People left there to come here, right? I'm not even saying it negatively. I'm just saying it just as it is. And from all around the mountains, right? And so that's why you've got people now who are driving from, at the furthest, an hour away to get here. Okay? It didn't just happen here. This is all over the place. This literally happened all over, not just Australia, it happened all over the West. If you go to America, this happened in America. It happened in Canada, happened in New Zealand, happened in the UK, happened in Europe, it happened all over the place. Right? Because of fundamental disagreements about how these things have proceeded. Because, unfortunately, we live in a time where, again, the highest authorities in the land, not only do they not recognise, they abjectly, intentionally, willingly, knowingly, and with incredible zealousness and devotion, reject the idea that there is any authority over them. Again, this goes in politics, it goes in economics, it goes in education, it goes in media. As it all systematically joins together, there is a fundamental rejection of any authority higher than the highest authorities, earthly speaking, in the land. And when you do that, they become gods. And they then dictate what is true, they dictate what is real, they dictate what is reality, and you end up in these kinds of scenarios to cut us off from God. But I'm not bringing it up, I'm not just having a rant here, this is literally the same dynamic, that's why I'm bringing it up, right? If the powers that be can cut us as people, including us as Christians, off from God as the highest authority, who then becomes the highest authority? They do. If God no longer dictates what is moral, someone else must dictate what is moral. If God no longer dictates what is true, someone else must dictate what is true. I'm not saying we believe that. I'm saying in terms of how that functions in a society or in a civilization or a culture, right? It is how you make people utterly dependent on something else other than God, right? It is why, by and large, at least in the overwhelming sense, it was faithful Christians that stood against the tyranny that happened during COVID, okay? We weren't the only ones, right? And we didn't do it anywhere near enough as much as we should, and I lament that and will to the day that I die. Not for myself, I was consistent from day one, but I'm talking about corporately as Christians and my fellow clergymen, right? However, the preponderance of those who stood against it were faithful Christians, okay, who could see what was true and saw that no, there are actually rules here, and there are actually commands, and there is actually an authority higher than you or me or anyone else, to which we're accountable. And there's only one who dictates what is truth. And with the utmost respect, it's not the health minister. Okay? It's the same tactic. That's exactly what we see in our society today. Cutting people off from God in order to drive them to another authority figure, another source of truth. It's why, again, like I know I quoted it in jest earlier, but it's why you can end up with an absolutely asinine scenario like what the former Kiwi Prime Minister said during that time, which is, "We are your sole source of truth." Literally, that's a quote. We will be your sole source of truth and information. Ardern, yeah. At a press conference. I'm not having a hack. That's the same kind of sentiment was effectively articulated here. Yes, exactly. But that's a direct quotation, right? The concept of any human being at any time uttering those words is mind-blowing. We will be your sole source of truth and information. It's the same tactic you're seeing here, right? So I'm trying to give us that example. They're trying to isolate the Galatians from Paul, so that they're now starved for leadership and guidance, and they will come to those who try to replace him and swoop in and try and establish themselves as genuine leaders. right? That's how they're attempting to effectively conquer these churches from within, in this case, right? Verse 19 and verse 20. My children, with whom I am again in labour until Christ is formed in you. He's using an analogy here, right? He's using, obviously, the analogy of a mother, right? Or kind of like he's using a similar kind of analogy, actually, to which he began this very chapter, right? Back up in verse 1 to remind you, he used the whole example of an heir, right? H-E-I-R. The heir, like a child who would inherit his father's estate, right? So he used the fatherly son analogy. Now he's using the mother and child side. So he's using, it's almost like a bookend, right? Between verses 1 and verse 19 to 20, right? He's using this familial language, and then right in the middle of that, of course, is verse 12, brothers, right? The fatherly image, the motherly image, the brotherly image, right? He's couching all of this in familial language, in the language of family, pardon me. For this reason, because again, that is exactly what is fundamental to the Christian religion, amongst so many other things, is family, right? All Christians are part of the family of God. We are the children of God, right? Human beings in general are not children of God. That would be a misunderstanding or a misnomer, right? But when you are adopted into the kingdom of God, you become a child of God or a son of God, using it in the titular sense like we saw in that previous chapter, right? In chapter 3. Again, all this kind of other analogies, they're not meant to contradict, they're just different aspects of this kind of family language, right? The body of Christ, the bride of Christ. There's all these different analogies which are given to describe family and the close-knit nature of family, the fact that the family is the fundamental building block of civilization. It's the fundamental building block of who we are as people, right? We've actually preached on that before, believe it or not, back earlier on in Deuteronomy, right? Again, in contravention to the modern post-Enlightenment liberal ideology. I don't mean the political party, although I suppose technically I mean liberalism as a political philosophy. The individualism of the modern age, right? So for 250 years essentially now in the West, we have considered the individual to be the basic unit of society, right? We're now learning that that's a horrible mistake, and it's actually led us to most of our problems. Individuals are not the building block of anything, right? Because unless you descended out of the heavens with a golden beam, you came from a mother and a father. Though your mother and your father may have been wonderful, your mother and your father may have been utterly atrocious, your mother and your father may have died early on, your mother and your father may have been anything along that spectrum. It's not a commentary on the nature of your parents or how they went or their behaviour or who they were to you, all those kinds of things. In a very basic, elementary sense, we all have parents. I know that's very obvious. But the reason why that's the case is, again, humanity didn't begin with a single individual in the garden. It began with a husband and a wife. It began with family, right? Family is the very building block of human culture, of human civilization, not the individual. It was a critical mistake that was made philosophically in the 17th century, particularly in the 18th century, that has then led us down the road that we're now on. Because, of course, again, without going down this tangent, because Karen already touched on this, if we're all just individuals, then, of course, my truth is my truth and your truth is your truth. And I can decide to become a woman, and I can decide to redefine marriage, and I can decide what's real and true in the world, right? It's this individualism that we're currently plagued with. As far as God is concerned, again, we have this aspect of where he clearly cares for us as individuals. It's not like individuals are not real. We're obviously each our own person in that sense, right? I am not my brother. I am not my mother. I am not my father, right? I am me. However, my existence has no meaning intrinsically outside of my mother and my father, because I wouldn't exist outside of my mother and my father. Neither would you, nor you, or any of us, right? I'm saying to you, the relationship's not the quality of the relationship is on this specific subject irrelevant, right? The existence of it is what I'm talking about, okay? Family is the basic unit, right? It's why Christianity has so valued the family more than anything. Right? I'm not saying other cultures don't value family, but no one has valued family more than us. Okay? Because we understand these basic concepts. Right? It's why also prevailing upon that is that even when our own human families, in terms of relationally speaking, break down, hope is not lost because of our connection to the family of faith or the household of faith. Right? That's why we get that terminology, the household, right? The household of faith. It's why we speak endearingly of the house of God, right? Talking about a church, for example, right? It's a, how would I say? It is an endearing phrase, right? That when we join together in the house of God, we are with our family, our spiritual family. And that spiritual family is, of course, made up of multiple families like any community, right? It's a bunch of different families who are Christians, no matter what size they are, joining together as one spiritual family, right? It's a very beautiful image. Hence why God, of course, is called our Father. And he has a son. All this beautiful familial language, right? Paul absolutely considers himself, not only to the Galatians, he uses this phrase elsewhere. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's to the Corinthians or the Colossians. I need to check which one. I'm pretty sure it's the Corinthians. In fact, actually, yes, it is the Corinthians, that he refers to himself as their father, right? It's why throughout much of Christian history, in fact, the majority of it, clergymen have been referred to as father, right? It's not the sometimes the Protestant misunderstanding of that is that that's it's taking the place of the heavenly Father. That's not what it means. It's just like we call our earthly father or dad. That doesn't mean that we're replacing God the Father with our earthly father, right? It's because the Apostle Paul refers to himself as like a spiritual father to them, right? He's their leader. He's their guide. He's raised them up in the faith. It's all this very consistent, very poetic, very beautiful familial language which is inherent to Christianity, right? And so calling it, look, I'm not asking you to call me that. I'm just saying that because that's not our tradition. But it's not wrong in various different Christian traditions historically for people to refer to their ministers or their clergymen as father. He uses this analogy here: my children, with whom I am again in labour until Christ is formed in you. Right? He's speaking about, again, he's using this analogy of a mother and child and being in labour. Right? The pains of labour. Right? This is a painful, difficult time, right? I'm trying to bring you to maturity. I'm trying to bring you up in Christ, right? And this is painful this time because you're at enmity with me, even though I'm the one who's brought you into the newness of spiritual life. Again, he's not being arrogant here. He's just, God used him to do it, right? He's 100% correct. He's not saying that they're not God's children, but they're also his children in that sense spiritually. Again, it's very endearing language. You just need to understand how it's used, right? The ancient people spoke like this all the time, right? My children, with whom I am again in labour until Christ is formed in you, right? Verse 20, but I could wish to be present with you now and to change my tone because I am perplexed about you, right? I'm perplexed about you. It's almost, in some sense, mirroring verse 11, to a degree at least, right? I fear for you that perhaps I have laboured over you in nothing. In that case, ironically, he's talking about labouring in the work, like labour, like literally working, that kind of labour. He then finishes this section with labour in the different sense, in this case, the maternal kind of labour. So he's using this play on words almost, right? With the same word, just in the different context, so it means the different thing. He wishes he could be present with them so that they could hear so that he could use a different tone. Right, because again, he's very direct, super blunt, and it's obvious from this letter that he's angry. Right? Now, in fairness, he's rightfully angry. Again, anger is something which can be righteous or unrighteous. Right? The kind of anger that is reactive, that's snappy, that fires back, or that's born of jealousy, of bitterness, those kind of things, that anger is sinful. But that being smart, and this, I know this might seem obvious, but all too often in my experience, it's actually not obvious enough. The kinds of evils that we see in our time, just as he sees in his time, should make you angry. Like, it should make you angry. At this point now, kind of 55-ish years after things like in America, Supreme Court decisions like Roe v. Wade in 1970. The best estimates of the abortion numbers are somewhere in the ballpark of about 65 to 70 million, roughly. That's what's generally estimated, right? At its peak in the 80s and the 90s, the Americans were aborting about 1.5 million babies a year, right? We look down our nose at historical instances of death and other such things when we in the West, and again, our numbers are proportionately, roughly speaking, equal to that. We don't keep very good statistics at all here on that subject, and that's by design, so that we don't have to confront the reality of it. The Americans are just very analytical and statistical in their culture. We choose not to, but the estimates are somewhere between about 80 to 100,000 a year here, which proportionally speaking is about the same ratio when you adjust for population, more or less. But either way, you're talking 80 to 100,000 basically since the 90s here, so millions, right? That should make you angry. It should make you angry. It's why God's anger is spoken of so often in the Old Testament and the New, right? And we look at that and we have this disconnect and we don't understand the anger. Not really. It's not like we disagree with it per se. We just don't understand it. We don't understand when God says that he hates something, or even in many instances hates someone, like when he says, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated, right? Because, of course, we've been implicitly taught that things like anger or hatred are per se, so in other words, in itself, automatically bad or wrong or evil or sinful or whatever. No, you should hate evil. You should hate evil. All right? If you don't hate evil, I would have questions as to how much you love good. Right? And that would be a fairly logical inference. If you see evil being done and there's not a sense of anger or hatred toward that, it does raise legitimate questions as to just how much you actually genuinely love what is good and true, right? It's the kind of lukewarmness that's warned against in Christ's message to the Laodiceans in Revelation 3, for example, right? I wish that you were either hot or cold, because at least you'd be something definitive. At least you'd be something. Right? At least it would be obvious, and you'd either be hot or you're cold, and both have their purposes, right? In the winter, the hot water is great. In the summer, the cold water is great. In summer and winter, the lukewarm water is hell. Okay, no one wants the lukewarm water, right? There's no time in which the lukewarm water is good, right? Each has its purpose. He's using analogy. He does this for all the letters, right? The Valley of the Lycus, we actually saw Laodicea earlier near Colossae. There's hot springs that run from Hierapolis on the northern side of the valley, right? I've been there. There's then a river that runs in and through and by near Laodicea, and in Laodicea, the waters from the hot springs across the northern side of the valley would combine with the stream of water, which you actually do see on your map there, the cold water. Hopefully your map shows it. If not, one of them does. I think certainly Janine's one does. Running through to Colossae and Laodicea. They are elevated, yeah. They've got the Valley of the Lycus, you've got Laodicea on the southern side up in the mountains, the Hierapolis in the north. And the water would combine into a single stream running through Laodicea, and it would be notoriously lukewarm because it's hot and this cold water combining, right? So he uses that analogy. I'd rather you be hot or cold, because lukewarmness is never good. That's the case in relation to these things. So that's why he finishes off by saying, I'm perplexed about you, right? I'm at odds, right? As to what to do or to how to proceed. What would that be? Apotomai. I am perplexed. I am befuddled. I am I am confused, I suppose. Well, that's a bit of a different context and a different word. I'm perplexed as to what to do here, because I've been teaching you all this, and now what? I've become your enemy. Again, it all ties back to kind of that verse 16 is really kind of the hammer of this passage, really, effectively. Have I really become your enemy because I tell you the truth, right? Because in a sense, he has, right? He has become, in part, not in full, but in part, their enemy in this instance, because he's telling them the truth, and because they're increasingly in droves siding with the Judaizers, not him, right? And at least at the time, it also had apostolic backing because Peter sided with them, right? Peter, again, none of these are knocks, right? When we're honest about the apostles, it actually does them credit. An issue for St. Peter was courage, okay? It's not that he had no courage, but it's an issue of cowardice. I mean, obviously courage being the opposite of cowardice. We see that at the trial of Christ when he denies the Lord 3 times. Okay? There's nothing terribly complex there. Many would have denied him, others may not have denied him. Those kinds of hypotheticals are largely irrelevant. St. Peter was one of the kind of men who under that pressure would cave, right? And we as people, both men and women in different ways, have different thresholds as to what kind of pressure we would or would not cave under. Everyone eventually reaches a limit, especially if you're talking about more obvious things like torture, I mean, as in like literally physical torture, right? So like St. Thomas Cranmer in the 16th century, right? The Archbishop of Canterbury during the English Reformation things were going well until Henry VIII's daughter, Mary, who we call back as Bloody Mary, came to the throne in 1553. She was in allegiance to the Pope and was a rather violent woman. Not that she ever did it herself, because that's usually how cowardice works, but having others do it for you. And she arrested Cranmer as Archbishop of Canterbury and tortured him for 4 months until he recanted. Well, the reality is that anyone who gets tortured for 4 months is going to say anything, right? Because that's the nature of it. It's just the human spirit will eventually break. The body breaks. It depends. The spirit always breaks before the body, generally speaking. And anyone who undergoes 4 months of consistent torture will break. He turns it around though. He recants his recantation when he's eventually burnt at the stake. But in general sense, what I'm trying to get at here is that people have different thresholds. And in this case, for some people, the threshold is higher, the threshold is lower. St. Peter was under incredible pressure to give an element of credence during the trial of Christ as this bloodthirsty mob of his fellow countrymen, his fellow Jews, were out to kill anyone and everything associated with Christ. And he recants when he's also under pressure again from the exact same kind of group, in this case the Judaizers, his fellow Jews there in Galatia. He also caves, and that's what we have recounted in chapter 2, right? But again, he bounces back after that, okay? Right? All this is to point to what is the core essence of this. In that moment, Peter had become an enemy of the truth. Sadly, right? But again, he repented of that, and God graciously brought him back and made him better than before. Right? But much of this has to do with the nature of truth, and this kind of lesson has to do with this tangent he goes on here, which is very directly related, obviously, but it's an important tangent. Has to do with the nature of truth. It has to do with more importantly, the relation to truth and how that impacts human interactions. Right? It has to do with the dynamics that exist in regards to manipulation. Much of this passage is about manipulation and about how manipulators work, what their objectives are, what their strategies are, their tactics are, right? How they proceed to do those things. In this case, taking those who are younger or inexperienced, cutting them off from their leaders, isolating them. That's what the essence of pushing out is, right? You isolate them so that they then become necessary for what they were formerly dependent on in a good way, but now they're lacking and you then swoop in with the solution to that dependency. That's why we spoke so much about things in our own culture or our own time, because those same manipulation tactics are just things that work. They work now, they work 1,000 years ago, they work 1,000 years ago before that, they'll work 1,000 years into the future from now, right? They're just things that work, right? There's all kinds of different tactics that work, and we see those throughout the scriptures. You see that going all the way back to the Garden of Eden. You see a different manipulative tactic there than the one you see here, right? Beyond just lies, obviously. I'm talking about the actual tactical strategy. And this is the nature of how these things work. It's why, of course, this essence of deception is so endemic to the very heart of the scriptures and of the human, and really of the human story across cultures. It's why the single most consistent image of evil is the serpent in any culture, right? By and large, because the sneaky, slithering aspect of the serpent, which ties back into this real history of the ancients, in going back into the early chapters of Genesis, has prevailed itself throughout the psyche and the memory of human culture. The tongue, the gaze of the serpent, the slithering motion, the ability to move silently, right, before it strikes and kills, all these kinds of things, right? This kind of serpentine imagery is sure. Yeah, like I'm saying, it's in recent living memory, and I get that, right? But these kinds of things are things just throughout history. But yeah, he wishes he could change his tone, saying to you, I wish I could be present with you now and to change my tone, right? So that you can hear the sincerity of how much I care about you, right? Because he still cares. This is the thing that gets lost too, and I'll essentially finish with this point, is that even though he's clearly angry, he's clearly very heated, he actually gets to the end of this letter. I mentioned this all the way back at the very, very first lesson that we actually did, but the way that letters are written in the ancient world, well, in fact throughout most of human history actually, but including in the ancient world, Paul's not physically writing these letters. No one physically wrote their own letters. You would dictate, yeah. You would dictate, and then you would have a scribe write it for you, right? He then actually we know because the actual syntax of the sentence starts to change, right? At the end of chapter 6, which is the last chapter, the last kind of portion, Paul clearly takes the pen and starts writing himself, right? Because it's now actually written slightly differently than what everything that's come beforehand. It's the same author, right? But because he's now writing it, not his scribe, who's using obviously his own format, it then changes, right? So he's so fired up by the time he gets to chapter 6, what we call chapter 6, he actually just grabs the pen out of the scribe's hand effectively and starts writing it. That's what must have happened, right? He's really fired up here, right? And he's angry. But this little almost kind of interlude, it's not literally an interlude, but this almost tangential interlude is like him reminding and showing the intention, much of the intentionality behind the letter. If he didn't care about these people, he wouldn't be writing this letter in the first place. Okay. It's why we tend to get into arguments much more with family than we ever do with strangers. Right? The people we're much more likely to argue with are those whom we know the best, right? Right? Because we don't care. We don't give a tinker's cuss about some random stranger on the street unless it's something really obvious. It's just like, no, we don't care. And that's fine. You can't care about all this stuff. You're not meant to care. You're not meant to care. You can't care about 8 billion people, right? It doesn't work that way. You have a finite RAM capacity in your brain to be able to care for X amount of people in your life. And it's always going to be a hierarchy. And in fact, it should be a hierarchy. In Christian terminology, it's what we call the order amoris, the order of love, right? You should love your family, right? Husband, wife, whatever the dynamic is there, the spouse, the children, right? And then from there, it's the rest of your clan or extended family. It's then your church. It's then, right? You should all be loving. You should all love your own family much more than you love me, That's the order of precedent, right? But we argue with those people because we care about them. And we care about the dynamic, we care about things in their life, in our life, in the family, whatever it is, right? He cares about these people. Because as he says, again, using that analogy, he's used, again, through these 20 verses now, he's used 3 different familial analogies. Father, Son, at the beginning, verse 1, and at the end here, or the end, I'm saying the bookend for us at this point, verse 19, 20, mother, child, and then in the middle, brothers. I beg you, brothers, right? Brotherhood. So he's using this familial language as almost like a literary device, right? As different. It's almost like the framework of these first 20 verses, where beginning, middle, and end has different images from the family. Right? It's quite clever, and easy to miss if you're not paying attention to it, to be honest with you. But it shows this deeply familial kind of theme or motif that's inherent in Christianity, right? Of family, of brotherhood, of parents guiding and caring for their children, of children being raised up by parents who do actually love them and care for them, right? All these kinds of things. So yeah, quite an interesting little personal direction he goes on. And again, this very, very powerful verse right in the middle of it, of verse 16. Have I really become your enemy because I tell you the truth? Right? Or to use a specific wording, have I become your enemy by telling you the truth? The answer, of course, to remind us as we finish is that if I have become your enemy by telling you the truth, it's because you have become the enemy of the truth. If I've become your enemy for telling you the truth, it's because you are an enemy of the truth. So, there we go.